Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to episode number 10 of History for Shut-ins. Today, we will talk about the British Southern strategy in the Revolutionary War, which includes the sieges of Savannah and Charleston, as well as the Battle of Camden, South Carolina. So let's get underway. The Siege of Savannah takes place from September 23rd through October 18th of 1779. Think of what has happened up to this point. Fighting in the North, for the most part, is all but over. We've had the battles of Saratoga, Brandywine, and Germantown in 1777. We talked about the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778. So we're now moving south as the British are thinking, they're occupying New York, they had occupied Philadelphia and have since moved, and they're thinking the best way to bring the colonies back into the family is to work from the southern end and come up the coast. So the Siege of Savannah is a failed attempt by the colonies and French forces to take the port city from the British. It was one of the costliest battles of the war in terms of casualties. The multinational forces on the American side include naval and land forces under Count Charles Henry d'Estaing of France, Irishmen of the Dillon Regiment, commanded by Colonel Arthur Dillon, makes sense, a mixed force of cavalry called Pulaski's Legion, led by Polish aristocrat Casimir Pulaski, and General Benjamin Lincoln's force of regular militia for a total of about 7,000 men. British defenders are under the leadership of General Augustine Prevost. He's got about 3,500 men, so about half the force of the Allied forces. Prevost's men include Highland regulars, Hessians, Southern Loyalists, Native Americans, and formerly enslaved African Americans who were promised their freedom if they fought with the British against the colonies. The colonies do the same thing. They offer the same to slaves. Savannah is about 17 miles inland, 17 miles from the river's mouth on the first firm ground inland from the Atlantic. The city is an extremely important Atlantic port. Look at the British strategy throughout the Revolutionary War. Yesterday we talked about the importance of naval power, sea power. Where do the British try to set up camp? First in Boston, then in New York, then in Philadelphia, now in Savannah. Then they're going to go to Charleston, all port cities, so that they can move their troops quickly and have them disembark and then work from the interior, towards the interior. The port of Savannah served plantations in the area as a transportation and mercantile hub. It was a key strategic point that provides the British with a base easily accessed from the sea and from which it can reconquer the rest of Georgia and then threaten South Carolina. By late 1778, the British concluded that the war in the North was a stalemate, as we have talked about, and they began to shift their focus south because they are under the impression that there are large numbers of loyalists living in the South. Having failed to initially take Charleston in 1776, the British focused on the smaller port of Savannah. A force of about 3,000 under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell captured Savannah on December 29th from U.S. Major General Robert Howe, ironically enough. It's also the British general's name, and Howe had a force of 900 patriots. In April of 1779, Washington presses John Jay, who is the eventual first Supreme Court Chief Justice. At this time, he's the President of Congress. Washington presses Jay to mobilize the Navy, the United States Navy, against the British in Savannah. Washington also sought French help. He proposed an operation against the British to the French minister, Conrad Alexander Gerard de Ravenel, using Count Charles Henry d'Estaing's French naval squadron, which at the time had been operating in the Caribbean. If this force could not join a renewed attack on Manhattan that had failed the previous year, Washington wanted d'Estaing to come to Georgia. So even Washington is saying, if we can't dislodge the British out of New York City, let's head to Georgia and do some damage there. Shortly afterward, Washington orders Brigadier General Charles Scott to take 3 Virginia regiments to reinforce Lincoln, the colonial commander of the U.S. Army in the South. The British move towards Charleston. Despite Washington's request, or they move from Charleston, pardon me. Despite Washington's request, d'Estaing stays in the West Indies. What's in the West Indies? It's a trading hub. Lots of money, lots of loot, lots of booty. Remember yesterday when we spoke, the British got caught up in the West Indies for about 6 months rather than being able to support their troops in the colonies, which was a big problem. D'Estaing stays in the West Indies until he learns that Savannah had been weakened by Brigadier General Augustine Prevost's expedition to Charleston in June of 1779. Sailing for the mainland in August of 79, d'Estaing hits the Georgia coast briefly in early September to establish communications with Lincoln, the U.S. commander in the South. To Lincoln, d'Estaing expresses his desire in view of the season for a rapid strike on Savannah. It's it's an opportune time to hit. He and Lincoln agree to meet and join their forces in front of Savannah on September 17th of 1779. So before the winter hits. Yes, this is Georgia, so it's not as brutal as Boston and New York and Philadelphia, but still, winter weather in the South is not always the best. Seeing French warships near Tybee Island prompts the British on the 4th of September to send orders, quote, to all the outposts to hold themselves in readiness to join, quote, his forces in Savannah. Despite the scare, d'Estaing does not begin to land his forces until the 12th of September. So there's a delay. Then he begins to put 4,000 soldiers ashore at Beaulieu Plantation on the Vernon River, 10 miles south of Savannah. So they've got, once they've completed their sea voyage, they've got to march 10 miles to Savannah, which is the point of the siege. French landings are completed on the 15th of September, and they then take up positions a few miles south of Savannah. On the 16th of September, d'Estaing sends a demand to Prevost, the British commander, to surrender. But Prevost says, let me think about it. Can you give me 24 hours to respond? Had d'Estaing attacked immediately, Savannah may have fallen into Allied hands. As events unfold, Prevost not only gains that crucial 24-hour window, but reinforcements led by Colonel Maitland, Lieutenant Colonel Maitland, arrived from Beaufort, South Carolina. This forced the French and the colonials to undertake siege operations that allowed Prevost an additional 2 weeks to prepare. So all this time is lost. French warships and artillery opened fire on Savannah on October 4th, and it goes on through October 8th. At that point, D'Estaing's engineers, French engineers, tell him that it would take time to build up their works to British lines. Then he was prepared to concede. Then D'Estaing was prepared to concede, which is ironic because he's already conceded so much time. The operation had consumed more time than D'Estaing anticipated, and his concern for the West Indies, of course, economic always, and pressure from his captains, who were increasingly worried about lingering on a coastline exposed to bad weather and a sudden approach by the British. All of this causes D'Estaing to decide on an immediate assault. Lincoln agrees, and an assault early on October 9th is planned. Savannah overlooks the Savannah River and Hutchinson's Island from high ground on the south bank of the river. The river is not wide. However, except immediately in front of the city of Savannah, if any of you have been there was a broad belt of marshland that bordered, I should say, the lower reaches of the river on both sides. In 1779, large bodies of men and their supporting trains could only cross those marshy strips along a few very narrow causeways. So it's almost like when you're yielding onto a multi-lane highway, or when you're yielding from 4 lanes to 3 or 3 to 2. You're starting to really make it easier for the enemy to concentrate their fire, and it will then take you longer, with or without fire, to cross. So what happens is that on the south bank, the main roads into Savannah converged on the city across slightly lower terrain to the south that was occupied by the French and the Patriots. Numerous marshlands and rivers guarded the eastern approaches to Savannah. There was a low boggy area west of Savannah that was cut by a stream known as Musgrove Creek that emptied into the river above town. British defenses of Savannah consisted basically of two concentric lines of works that formed a semicircle around the city's south side and touched the river on both ends. Several strong points, including the Spring Hill Redoubt across the Augusta Road, constituted the first line of defense. This line of defense was supported by additional works in the rear and screened in front by trees that had been cut down. In front of these fortifications, the Allies, the French and the colonists, constructed a partial line on the southeast approach to the city. The Allies' main attack was planned, as I said, on 10/9 to strike the British defenses on their right prior to sunrise on the 9th. The main body of French soldiers, who were being led by D'Estaing, aimed at the Spring Hill Redoubt. Farther left, Lincoln, the colonial commander, advances with 2 columns, which the leading column is under Lieutenant Colonel John Laurens, and the second is under Brigadier General Lachlan McIntosh. And it's that second unit that covers the flank of the main French formation. Colonel Arthur Dillon, remember, the Irish soldiers, if you will, led his troops into the line closest to the river beyond Lauren's soldiers. Behind the infantry on the left, Polish Count Pulaski's cavalry legion waited to exploit any breaks in the British lines. The remaining U.S. or colonial formations deployed to the British left to conduct feint attacks, F-E-I-N-T, feint attacks, at the eastern end of British fortifications. If they encountered any weaknesses, they were ordered to exploit it. Makes sense. A reserve advanced part way after the attacking force. The Allies scheduled their assault to start before sunrise. Despite a covering fog, delays and confusion kept them from advancing on time. So another delay that helps Prevost, right? If you're looking to attack before sunrise and you have that covering fog, you couldn't ask for more. Remember, it was a fog that helped Washington get his troops off of the island of Manhattan after that battle. Helps to save the army to fight another day. Unfortunately, it does not happen here. When they finally moved forward, the Allied troops, they were exposed to the fire of the British. Disorder reigns, to say the least. Despite repeated attempts, repeated charges, and heavy losses, the Allies failed to secure their objectives. After they retreat, the Allies, they request a truce. Prevost, it's amazing how this has changed. So Prevost initially is given the opportunities to surrender. He says, give me 24 hours, and then things just spin out of control. What does Prevost do? Well, first, he knows that he's got maybe 50 to 55 casualties. And he knows that the Allies have lost at least 1,000, maybe up to 1,200. Washington is fearful about what has taken place. The failure of the combined efforts of Lincoln's troops and French forces to retake the port of Savannah soon leads to a British expedition against Charleston. The southern colonies would remain in British hands until Yorktown. So we're still a good 2 years out. The British plan to capture Charleston and use it as a base for further operations in the southern colonies, much like Savannah. Clinton, the British commander, evacuates Newport, Rhode Island in October of 1779 and leaves the large garrison of New York City under Commander Kniphausen, who we've spoken about earlier during the Battle of Saratoga, or not Saratoga, pardon me, Brandywine specifically. On December 26th, Clinton and Cornwallis sailed southward with about 8,500 troops, 5,000 sailors, and 14 warships. They hit very stormy weather. The fleet anchors in the Savannah River, on February 1st of 1780, after the colonials have surrendered after the Siege of Savannah. By February 12th, Clinton has his army 30 miles south of Charleston on Simmons Island. By the 24th of February, the British crossed the Stono River onto James Island, and by the 10th of March, Cornwallis made it into the mainland with his forces. Between March 11th and March 21st, the British fortified their position, which was located where the Wapoo Creek flowed into the Ashley River. They mounted artillery, to shell Allied ships, and really at this point it's American ships. And they also did it to keep the Ashley River secure. The British then moved upstream and north away from Charleston, slowly securing plantations along the way while the Americans shadowed them across the river. On the 29th of March, under the cover of fog, the British crossed the Ashley River upstream from the heavily fortified Ashley Ferry and established themselves on Charleston Neck. So they are now on the same side as the American forces. When the Americans learned that the British were on the neck, the Americans abandoned their breastworks at Ashley Ferry. On April 1st, the British moved down into position to begin the siege. While the British are slowly closing in, colonial naval maneuvering in Charleston Harbor was a complete disaster. In December of 1779, 4 frigates had arrived under the command of Commodore Abraham Whipple, and those 4 ships were joined by another 4 ships from South Carolina and 2 French ships. There were 260 guns afloat and 40 guns at Fort Moultrie. The flag behind me, let me get out of the way, is commonly referred to as the Fort Moultrie flag. This flag flew in Charleston in 1776 after the first unsuccessful attempt by the British to take Charleston. You can see the crescent moon, and the color blue here, which are both big parts of the current South Carolina state flag. So onward we go. So we're at Fort Moultrie and this is on the 8th of April that the British fleet move into the harbor under fire from Fort Moultrie. On the 12th, Clinton orders Bannister Tarleton, who is a cavalry commander, and Ferguson, another commander, to capture Monk's Corner, which is a crossroads south of the Biggins Bridge near the Santee River in South Carolina. Brigadier General Isaac Huger is stationed there with about 500 men under orders from Lincoln, again the colonial commander, to hold so that communications with Charleston would remain open. On the 13th of April, during the evening, Tarleton gave orders for a silent march. Later that night, the British intercepted a messenger with a letter from Huger to Lincoln and learned how the rebels were deployed around Charleston. At 3 a.m. on the 14th of April, the British reached the U.S. lines, the U.S. post, completely catching the rebels by surprise and quickly routing them. Following the skirmish, the British fan out across the countryside and cut off Charleston from outside support. This is a lesson that they learned from the Battle of Breed's Hill. Remember, after Lexington and Concord, you have all sorts of militiamen coming from all over New England and reinforcements from the Continental Army coming into Boston. Here the British say, we are going to ensure that that does not happen in Charleston. South Carolina Governor John Rutledge actually evacuates Charleston. Not a good sign. On the 21st of April, a parley between Lincoln and Clinton, with Lincoln offering to surrender with honor. And what that means is Lincoln gets to keep his colors flying and he marches out fully armed. Clinton says, I'm in such a good position that I am going to refuse Lincoln's request. A heavy artillery exchange follows the denial. On the 23rd of April, Cornwallis crosses the Cooper River and assumes command of forces blocking the rebels' escape by land. Also, then on the 24th, the rebels ventured out to harass the British siege works. The lone American casualty is Tom Moultrie, brother of Brigadier General William Moultrie, for whom the Moultrie flag is named. On April 29th, the British advanced on the left end of the canal that fronted Charleston's fortifications to destroy the dam and drain the canal. The rebels knew the importance of the canal to the city's defenses and responded with fierce artillery and small arms fire. By the following night, the British had drained some water. On the 4th of May, several casualties had been sustained, and the fire had been so heavy that work was often delayed and suspended. On the 5th of May, the rebels make a countermove, but by the 6th of May, almost all water had drained out of the heavily damaged dam, and plans for an assault begin. On the 6th of May, Fort Moultrie surrenders. On the 8th of May, Clinton calls for unconditional surrender from Lincoln, but Lincoln again tries to negotiate. On the 11th of May, the British fire hot shot, it's called, that burns several homes in Charleston before Lincoln negotiates terms for surrender. The final terms dictated that the entire Continental force captured were now prisoners of war. On the 12th of May, surrender took place with Lincoln leading a very ragged bunch of soldiers out of the city. The senior officers of the Patriot Army, including Lincoln, eventually were exchanged for British prisoner of war officers. For all the others in the Continental Army, they had a long stay on prison ships in Charleston Harbor, which, if you were lucky to survive, many died of disease on those ships. Close quarters, poor food, poor ventilation, drafty, hot, sweltering, of course, depending on the time of year. The defeat left no Continental Army in the South. Hard to imagine. Even before Lincoln surrendered, the Continental Congress appointed the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, to replace him. The British quickly established outposts in a semicircle from Georgetown to Augusta, Georgia, with positions at Camden, South Carolina, 96, South Carolina, Cheraw, Rocky Mount, and Hanging Rock, all in South Carolina. Parole was offered to backcountry rebels, many accept. So this gives the British the feeling that they have great support in the South. Soon after securing Charleston, Clinton gives command of the Southern Theater to Cornwallis, and on the 5th of June, he sails back to New York City. Clinton's one order to Cornwallis before he leaves was to maintain possession of Charleston above all. Think of it, if you will, maybe it's a bad comparison. During the Civil War, Vicksburg is seen as the key on the Mississippi River. Lincoln said Vicksburg is the key, and we will not win until I hold the key in my pocket. Well, this is how the British see Charleston right now, because there's no fighting in Georgia, south of them. They've taken Savannah. They've now taken Charleston, and they are moving north. So they see Charleston as a big, big deal. Cornwallis was not to move into North Carolina if it jeopardized losing Charleston, or if it meant losing Charleston, pardon me. Clinton also ordered that all militia and civilians be released from their parole, but they must take an oath to the crown and promise to serve when they are called upon. This stipulation angers many of the locals and led to many deserting or ignoring the order and their terms of their parole. To put a bow on Charleston, and we've spent a lot of time talking about Charleston and Savannah, but they're vitally important. It also kind of sets the tone for the British mindset moving forward. The British captured more than 5,200 prisoners, more than 300 artillery pieces, more than 9,000 artillery rounds, almost 6,000 muskets, 33,000 rounds of ammunition, 212 hand grenades, nothing like present-day hand grenades, 15 regimental colors, which are a gigantic deal psychologically, 49 ships and 120 boats, more than 375 barrels of flour, and large magazines of rum, rice, and indigo. Following the surrender, the captured ordnance is brought to a powder magazine. A Hessian officer warns that some of the guns might be loaded and we have to be careful here, but he is ignored. One of the guns prematurely fires, detonating about 180 barrels of gunpowder, discharging 5,000 of the muskets in the magazine where they're being stored. The accident kills 200 and destroys 6 houses. The prisoners of the siege are then diverted to multiple locations, including prison ships, the old barracks, where actually today the College of Charleston stands, and the old Exchange and Provost dungeon. The defeat is a serious blow militarily and psychologically for the rebels. It's the largest surrender of a U.S. force under arms until 1862, when Union troops surrender at Harper's Ferry during the Antietam campaign. British troops consolidate their hold in the South and drive the remaining Patriot troops from South Carolina at the May 29th Battle of Waxhaws. During their surrender, the Americans were just denied the honors of war, an honorable surrender. This leads Washington to deny Cornwallis the same at Yorktown. Clinton sails back to New York City, believing his presence is necessary there to defend against a potential French-American attack, which doesn't take place there, of course, but much further south, leaving command of the Southern Theater to Cornwallis with orders to decrease the opposition in North Carolina, but he can't go into North Carolina if it jeopardizes their hold on Charleston. Though the surrender of Charleston is very substantial, British error in strategy soon becomes very apparent. There was no popular uprising of loyalists that the British command had been assured would happen, making control of the countryside difficult. Instead, resistance in South Carolina actually decreases or degenerates into a period of chaotic guerrilla warfare in the outlying areas. Before we move on to the Battle of Camden, if you have any questions while watching live or watching taped, please ask them. I've got a question. Can I add a historical musical component? I believe that I will tomorrow when we talk about Yorktown. So we will move on. We're going to end today with the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. It is a third crushing defeat for Patriot forces. It lowers morale even further and bolsters British confidence in their strategy to gain control of the southern colonies. It was fought on August 16th, 1780. It completely destroys the reputation of Horatio Gates. Remember, he is seen as the hero of Saratoga. There was talk for a short period, especially as part of the Conway Cabal, which we talked about yesterday, of Gates replacing Washington. It also sees the death of an important Allied general, Johann de Kalb, for whom de Kalb Pike in the Philadelphia area is named. Gates' mistakes at Camden lead to the very important change in leadership to a name that we have mentioned several times, a name that was at Trenton, a name that we mentioned yesterday often at Valley Forge. Washington made this general his quartermaster, Nathaniel Greene. Huge, huge improvement when Greene takes over. However, Gate has one parting gift for us, and that's the Battle of Camden. The British Southern Campaign, which was a strategy, as we've said, implemented by General Henry Clinton, had given them very swift control of the southern colonies with the fall of Savannah, the fall of Augusta, Savannah in December of 1778, Augusta in January of 1779, Charleston in May of 1780. They all are in British hands. At Camden, untrained Patriot troops are defeated. And not only are they untrained, but Gates' strategic and tactical errors just heighten the difference in the skill of the troops. After the fall of Camden, after the fall of Charleston, Camden became an important stronghold for the British in South Carolina. Cornwallis set up Camden as a strategic supply depot and garrison that would secure control of South Carolina's backcountry. Again, the British are under the false impression that there are large numbers of Southern loyalists that will come to the British's help, I should say. In July of 1780, Gates marches his troops to meet Cornwallis at Camden, hoping to free the South from the British. Gates carried the reputation, as we said, of leading the Patriot victory at Saratoga. Although his political reputation suffered due to his criticism of Washington as commander-in-chief during the Conway Cabal, Gates maintained his military chops up until this point. Fueled by his success in the North, Gates led his men to the British, confident in beating them. Gates, by the way, is a British citizen who is fighting with the colonials. Gates' ego made him blind to the deficiencies and shortcomings of his men. In July, when he marches his troops to Camden, Gates led his men through very swampy ground, scattered with loyalists who did little to assist the Patriot Army's need for food and supplies. By August, Gates' 5,000 men are sick with dysentery. Not all of them, but they are severely weakened by it. Gates ignored that dysentery had decreased his numbers, and he assumes that his army is actually twice the size of what it is at Camden. Gates gathers 3,000 men who were able to fight. On his right, he positions experienced regiments from Maryland and Delaware with militia from North Carolina in the center. As we have talked, militia were very unreliable during the Revolution. Yes, there were big numbers, but they were not as well trained as the colonial army, which of course is not as well trained as the British Army. So many times what happens during battles is that militia will fire a volley, perhaps two, and once they see the British coming, they run. So putting militia in the center is a real question mark here. So that's one of the issues. On the left were even less experienced militia on the left of the colonial line. These militia are from Virginia. Having been trained as a British officer, Gates should have understood the strategy that Cornwallis was going to employ, which would be to put his most experienced men to his right, which would be the left of the colonial line, which is where Gates puts his least experienced militia. British regulars under James Webster met Gates' Green Virginia militia, who run like hell. The North Carolina militia, holding the center line, ran despite efforts of colonial officers to hold them in place. With the colonists left and center running from the British, what are the British now able to do? Concentrate on the more experienced Continental Army troops on the right flank. Although these troops fought well, they could not beat back the British in the face of the panic, especially after the death of General Johann de Kalb. The commissioned Prussian officer was shot and killed as he led his men in battle. He was the first of 900 casualties, or he was one of 900 casualties, pardon me. Also, the rebels have 1,000 prisoners of war. Unlike Gates, who basically hopped on his horse and rode 60 miles to Charlotte, never really seeing the end of the battle, de Kalb dies honorably on the field. The stunning loss of men and the cowardice by Gates ruins his reputation, and you won't hear from Horatio Gates again. Nathaniel Greene would see to it that Cornwallis, in future battles, Cornwallis, who had won so easily here at Camden, would end up making the ultimate surrender of the entire British Army at Yorktown. We are going to end there today. Pretty somber note. We talked all about losses. Tomorrow, I promise you, we're going to end on a high note. Are there any questions before we call it a day here on History for Shut-ins, our 10th episode? Thank you, as I'm waiting for a question, if there is one. Thank you to everybody. Marple Public Library, Haverford Township Free Library, Radnor Public Library, Ocean City Public Library, White Marsh Parks and Recreation, and so many others who have spread the word about History for Shut-ins and are sharing feedback. As we don't have any questions, we will end there today. I will see you tomorrow, Friday, at 5 p.m. for our last History for Shut-ins for the week, and we will end our discussion of the Revolutionary War. Thanks so much. Have a good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.